The doors of the grand hall burst open before anyone was ready, and every candle in the room seemed to flicker at once. Elena stood at the back, half hidden behind a velvet curtain, when the Duke of Dellamoor walked in, with a presence that silenced the entire room. His boots struck the marble floor like a countdown to something no one could stop. Margaret and Charlotte, her two elder sisters, straightened their gowns and stepped forward eagerly, their smiles already rehearsed. Their mother, Lady Beatrice Ashworth, gripped her fan so tightly her knuckles turned pale. This was the moment the family had been waiting for. This was the marriage that would save them from complete collapse. Elena did not step forward. She never did. She had learned years ago that stepping forward only invited comparison, and comparison always ended the same way. She was the daughter nobody introduced first, the one whose name was often forgotten in polite conversation, the one who was simply called the other one. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Tonight was supposed to end with either Margaret or Charlotte becoming a duchess, and Elena returning to the shadows where she felt safest. The Duke's eyes moved across the room, slowly, deliberately, as if he were reading each person, rather than simply seeing them. Margaret lifted her chin. Charlotte tilted her head just enough to catch the candlelight in her hair. Lady Beatrice whispered something under her breath, a prayer or a command. It was hard to tell which. But the Duke's gaze did not stop on either of the sisters. It moved past them, past the glittering jewelry and the perfumed air, and landed on the girl standing quietly near the curtain. Elena felt her breath catch. She had not expected to be seen at all. The Duke crossed the room without a word, his long coat trailing behind him, like a shadow given shape. The guests parted instinctively, whispers rising like a wave gathering strength before it crashes. Lady Beatrice's smile faltered for the first time that evening. This was not part of the plan. This was not supposed to happen. He stopped in front of Elena, close enough that she could see the sharp line of his jaw and the coldness in his eyes, that everyone spoke about in hushed voices. Rumors about him traveled faster than carriages. Some said he had never smiled since the day his first engagement ended in betrayal. Others said he ruled his estate with such precision that even the wind did not dare disturb his gardens without permission. He was called many things, but never warm, never gentle, never kind. He studied Elena for a long moment, and she felt as though he were looking straight through the plain fabric of her dress and into every quiet, overlooked year of her life. Then he turned to Lord Ashworth, who had just entered the hall in a hurried attempt to take control of the situation, and spoke words that would echo through the entire province by morning. "I'll take the rejected one," he said, his voice calm and final, as if he were choosing a horse rather than a wife. The room went completely silent. Margaret's mouth opened slightly in disbelief. Charlotte's fan stopped mid-motion. Lady Beatrice's face turned the color of old parchment. Lord Ashworth, a man who prided himself on never being caught without a clever response, found himself utterly speechless. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Rejected one, that was what he called her, without hesitation, without softness, as though it were simply a fact and not an insult. And yet, in that same breath, he had chosen her over her sisters, over the daughters who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this moment. Lord Ashworth cleared his throat, his mind rushing through calculations. A duke was a duke, regardless of which daughter he wanted. The family's debts were mounting by the week, and refusing this offer would mean humiliation far worse than watching his least favored daughter marry the coldest man in the region. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "are you certain? Elena is. She is not accustomed to society. She does not carry herself the way her sisters do." "That is precisely why I want her," the Duke replied without looking away from Elena. He did not explain further. He did not need to. His word was law in every room he entered, and tonight was no exception. Elena's sisters exchanged a glance, filled with confusion, and something sharper, something that resembled jealousy, dressed up as concern. Neither of them understood why a duke, known for choosing only the most polished and celebrated women, would reach past them to select the daughter their own mother had once described as unremarkable in front of guests. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her voice trembling with forced composure. "Your Grace, surely you would prefer a more suitable match. Elena has never been trained in the arts of a proper household. She knows nothing of managing estates or entertaining nobility." The Duke's gaze finally shifted away from Elena, landing on Lady Beatrice with an intensity that made the older woman take an involuntary step back. "I did not ask for your opinion," he said quietly. "I asked for her hand. If your family cannot provide that without further debate, I will assume the offer of alliance no longer stands, and I will take my interests elsewhere, along with any financial considerations that came attached to this arrangement." The threat was clear, and it worked exactly as intended. Lord Ashworth's face paled at the mention of financial considerations. Whatever pride the family had left evaporated instantly. Within seconds, Lady Beatrice was nodding so quickly, her jeweled headpiece nearly slipped from her hair. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "Elena would be honored." Elena had not said a single word throughout the entire exchange. No one had asked her opinion. No one ever did. She had spent her whole life standing quietly, while decisions were made around her. Decisions about her future, her worth, her place in a family that never quite knew what to do with a daughter who did not shine the way the others did. But something about this moment felt different. For the first time, someone had walked into a room full of choices and chosen her. Even if the words he used stung more than she wanted to admit. The Duke turned to leave, as abruptly as he had arrived, pausing only once to look back at Elena. "The wedding will take place in 1 week," he said. "My carriage will arrive for you at dawn. Bring only what you need. Everything else will be provided." And then he was gone, his coat disappearing through the same doors he had entered, leaving behind a room full of stunned guests and a family whose entire future had just shifted in the span of a few sentences. The moment the doors closed behind him, the hall erupted into whispers. Margaret turned to her mother, her voice sharp with disbelief. Why her? Why would he choose her over us? Lady Beatrice did not answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on Elena, studying her daughter as though seeing her for the first time in years. There was no warmth in her expression, only calculation, the same calculation she applied to every decision that affected the family's standing. "We do not question a duke's choices," she said finally. "We accept them, and we make certain this arrangement benefits us in every way possible." Charlotte crossed her arms, clearly displeased. "And what about Elena? Does anyone care what she wants?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because the truth was obvious to everyone in the room. No one had asked Elena anything. No one ever did. Elena remained silent, as her family continued to argue around her, their voices rising and falling like a storm she had grown used to weathering. She thought about the Duke's cold eyes, the way he had said rejected one without a flicker of hesitation, and yet had still chosen her when he could have had either of her sisters instead. She did not know what to make of him. She did not know what to make of herself in that moment, standing at the center of attention for the first time in her life, yet feeling more invisible than ever, because none of the attention was truly about her. It was about debts, alliances, and the reputation of a family that had never once tried to understand her. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Elena sat alone in her small room at the far end of the house, the room her family had given her because it was the least desirable, farthest from the main halls, coldest in winter. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above her dresser and tried to imagine what her life would look like in 1 week's time. A duchess. The word felt foreign, almost impossible, attached to a name that had spent years being an afterthought. She thought of the Duke's voice, steady and unshaken, and wondered what kind of man could speak with such certainty about a woman he had never met. She wondered if his coldness was simply the truth of who he was, or if it was something else entirely, a wall built around something he did not want anyone to see. Elena did not sleep much that night. She packed the few belongings she owned into a single trunk, folding each item carefully, as though preparing for a journey far greater than a simple move across the countryside. She packed her mother's old shawl, worn thin from years of use, one of the few things in the house that had ever felt like it belonged to her, rather than being handed down after her sisters no longer wanted it. As dawn approached, she stood by her window and watched the sky shift from black to a deep, uncertain gray. Somewhere beyond the hills, a carriage was already making its way toward the Ashworth estate, sent by a man the entire region feared and admired in equal measure. Elena did not know what awaited her at Dellamoor. She did not know if the cold reputation surrounding the Duke was entirely true, or if there was something more hidden beneath his sharp words and unreadable expression. All she knew was that her life, quiet and unnoticed for as long as she could remember, was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. The carriage arrived exactly at dawn, its wheels crunching against the gravel path, with a sound that felt louder than it should have in the stillness of the morning. Elena stood at the entrance of the house, her trunk beside her, watching as the driver stepped down and opened the door without a word. There was no ceremony, no warmth, simply an expectation that she would step inside and begin the next chapter of her life without protest. Her family gathered briefly to see her off, though their farewells felt hollow, more focused on maintaining appearances for the neighbors who had gathered to watch than on any genuine sentiment toward Elena herself. Lady Beatrice offered a stiff embrace and a reminder to represent the family well. Margaret and Charlotte said little, their earlier jealousies simmering just beneath polite smiles. Lord Ashworth shook her hand, as though sealing a business transaction, rather than saying goodbye to his daughter. Elena climbed into the carriage without looking back. As the wheels began to turn, and the estate that had never truly felt like home faded into the distance, she allowed herself a single breath of something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, though there was plenty of that waiting beneath the surface. Not sadness, though a part of her ached at how easily her family had let her go. What she felt, more than anything, was the smallest flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, that perhaps this new life, however cold it seemed at first, might finally be one where she was truly seen. The journey to Dellamoor took most of the day, winding through hills and forests that grew increasingly unfamiliar the farther they traveled. Elena watched the landscape change through the carriage window, her mind racing with questions she had no answers to. What kind of household awaited her? What kind of man was the Duke truly, beneath the rumors and the cold words he had spoken in front of her entire family? As the carriage crested a final hill, the estate of Dellamoor came into view, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. The castle stood tall and imposing against the darkening sky, its stone walls ancient and weathered, yet undeniably grand. It was nothing like the modest Ashworth estate she had grown up in. This was a place built to withstand centuries, a place that had seen countless stories unfold within its walls, and now Elena's story was about to become one of them. The carriage came to a stop in the courtyard, and before Elena could gather her thoughts, the door opened, and a member of the household staff stepped forward to greet her. Her name was Grace, an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Elena slightly at ease. "Welcome to Dellamoor, my lady," Grace said, extending a hand to help Elena down from the carriage. "His Grace is currently occupied with estate matters, but he has instructed that you be shown to your quarters and given anything you require." Elena nodded, grateful for the small kindness in Grace's tone, a stark contrast to the coldness she had braced herself for. As she stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the towering castle before her, she could not shake the feeling that everything about her life was about to change, irreversibly and completely, and there was no turning back now. She took a deep breath, gathered what courage she could find within herself, and followed Grace through the massive doors of Dellamoor, stepping into a world she knew nothing about, married to a man whose heart remained as much a mystery as the countless corridors and chambers that awaited her inside. The quarters Grace led Elena to were far grander than anything she had ever known. A large bed with soft linens stood near a window overlooking the eastern gardens, and a fireplace crackled softly, already lit against the evening chill. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, unable to move, unable to believe that a room this beautiful was meant for her. "This is far too much," she said quietly, almost to herself. Grace smiled gently. "His Grace instructed that you be given the finest guest quarters until your wedding. Afterward, you will move to the chambers befitting a duchess." Elena did not know how to respond. She had spent her whole life in the smallest, coldest room of her family's house, and now she stood in a chamber larger than that entire room combined. She wondered, briefly, if this was simply another form of obligation, a duty the Duke fulfilled without any real feeling behind it, the same way one might feed a horse or maintain a garden because it was expected of them. That night, Elena did not see the Duke at all. She dined alone in her quarters, the food richer than anything she had tasted before, yet she found she had little appetite. Her mind kept returning to the moment in the grand hall, to the sharp certainty in his voice as he had chosen her, to the way his eyes had studied her, as though searching for something specific. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a strange blur of preparation. Seamstresses arrived to fit her for gowns finer than anything she had ever worn. Household staff moved through the halls with quiet efficiency, preparing the castle for a ceremony that would formalize a union built on necessity rather than affection. Elena barely saw the Duke during this time. He remained occupied with matters of the estate, appearing only briefly at meals, and even then, saying little beyond what courtesy required. She began to notice small things about him during these brief encounters. The way he always finished his meals before anyone else, as though eating quickly was simply another task to complete efficiently. The way his eyes would sometimes linger on the window, distant and unreadable, as though his mind were somewhere far beyond the walls of Dellamoor. The way the household staff moved around him, with a mixture of respect and caution, never quite relaxed in his presence, yet never afraid either. On the third day, Elena decided to explore the castle grounds, while the Duke was away, attending to business in the nearby village. She wandered through gardens more beautiful than any she had seen, past fountains that caught the afternoon light in delicate patterns, until she found herself in a quiet courtyard she had not noticed before. There, she discovered an elderly gardener struggling to lift a heavy sack of soil onto a cart. Without hesitation, Elena moved to help him, gripping the other end of the sack and lifting alongside him, until it settled safely into place. The old man looked at her with surprise. "My lady, you should not trouble yourself with such work." Elena smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I do not mind. I have never been afraid of a little effort." The gardener, whose name she learned was Edmund, though not to be confused with any noble titles, seemed genuinely touched by her willingness to help. As they spoke, Elena learned that he had worked at Dellamoor for over 30 years, long before the current Duke had inherited the title. "He was a different man once," Edmund said carefully, his eyes glancing toward the castle as though worried someone might overhear. "Before the sorrow came into his life. Before he built walls no one has managed to climb since." Elena's curiosity sharpened. "What sorrow?" Edmund hesitated, clearly uncertain whether he should share such things with someone so new to the household. "It is not my place to speak of it, my lady. Perhaps, in time, His Grace will share that part of himself with you." Elena did not press further, though the conversation stayed with her throughout the rest of the day. She began to understand that the Duke's coldness was not simply a matter of personality, but something built deliberately, brick by brick, around a heart that had once been hurt so deeply it had chosen to protect itself permanently. That evening, as Elena walked back toward the castle, she noticed the Duke standing alone, on a balcony, overlooking the gardens, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He had not noticed her approach, and for a brief moment, Elena saw something in his posture she had not expected. Not coldness, not distance, but something closer to exhaustion, as though the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him more heavily than anyone realized. She almost turned away, not wanting to intrude on a private moment, but something made her pause instead. "Your Grace," she called softly. He turned, his expression immediately shifting back into the composed, unreadable mask she had grown accustomed to seeing. "Lady Elena, I did not realize you were nearby." "I was walking through the gardens," she explained. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," he said, though his tone remained guarded. "This is your home now as well. You need not explain your presence within its walls." Elena stepped closer, gathering her courage. "May I ask you something?" He studied her for a moment before nodding once, a small, cautious permission. "Why did you choose me?" she asked. "Among all the women you could have selected, why choose someone your own words called rejected?" The Duke's expression did not change, though something flickered behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Because I have learned that those who are overlooked often carry the most value," he said finally. "Society rewards appearance and charm. It rarely rewards substance. I have had enough of charm to last a lifetime." Elena considered his words carefully. There was truth in them. She could sense that much, though there was also something unspoken beneath the surface, a history he had not shared, a wound that shaped every decision he made. "I do not know how to be a duchess," she admitted quietly. "I was never taught the things my sisters were taught. I do not know how to entertain nobility or manage a household of this size." "You will learn," he said simply, "or you will find your own way of doing things, which may prove more valuable than following traditions that no longer serve any real purpose." It was, perhaps, the closest thing to warmth Elena had heard from him since their first meeting. She did not know what to make of it, whether it was simply practicality speaking, or something more personal, hidden beneath his carefully measured words. The days continued in this manner, brief encounters filled with careful conversation, each one revealing small fragments of the man behind the cold reputation. Elena found herself growing curious about him in ways she had not anticipated, wanting to understand the walls he had built and why he had chosen to keep them standing for so long. The wedding day arrived faster than Elena expected. She stood in her chambers, as Grace and two other maids helped her into a gown finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing. Delicate lace, layered over silk the color of morning frost. Her reflection in the mirror looked almost like a stranger, elegant and composed, nothing like the overlooked daughter who had spent years standing in the shadows of her family's grand hall. "Are you nervous, my lady?" Grace asked gently, as she adjusted the final details of Elena's gown. Elena considered the question honestly. "I am uncertain," she said. "Not nervous in the way one might expect before a wedding, but uncertain about what kind of life awaits me here." Grace smiled kindly. "His Grace is not an easy man to understand. That much is true. But he is fair, and he is honorable, even if he struggles to show warmth the way others might expect. Give him time, my lady. I have worked in this household long enough to know that beneath his cold exterior lies a man capable of great loyalty." Elena held on to those words as she made her way toward the small chapel within the castle grounds, where the ceremony would take place, before only a handful of witnesses, family members from both sides, and select members of the household staff. Her own family arrived that morning, her mother's expression carefully composed into something resembling pride, though Elena knew better than to mistake it for genuine affection. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal words and solemn vows. The Duke stood beside her, his expression composed and unreadable as always, yet Elena noticed the slight tension in his hands, a small crack in his otherwise perfect control. When it came time to exchange vows, his voice remained steady, though something in his eyes, briefly, betrayed a depth of feeling he clearly worked hard to conceal. As the ceremony concluded and they were pronounced husband and wife, Elena felt the full weight of what had just happened settle over her. She was no longer simply Elena Ashworth, the overlooked daughter. She was now Elena, Duchess of Dellamoor, bound by law and duty to a man whose heart remained locked behind walls she had only just begun to understand. That evening, a small celebration was held within the castle's great hall, though it lacked the extravagance one might expect for a ducal wedding. The Duke had insisted on keeping the event modest, a decision that surprised many of the guests, but pleased Elena more than she expected. She had never enjoyed grand displays, and the quieter celebration felt more genuine than the elaborate spectacle her family would have preferred. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Elena found herself alone with the Duke for the first time as his wife. They stood together near one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, silence stretching between them, neither quite certain how to bridge the distance that still existed after only a single day of marriage. "This is a strange beginning," Elena said finally, breaking the silence. The Duke turned to look at her, his expression softening ever so slightly, an expression she had not seen from him before. "Most beginnings are strange," he said. "What matters is what we build from here." Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of the coldness the rest of society insisted defined him entirely. What she found instead was something far more complicated, a man carrying burdens she did not yet understand, choices shaped by pain she had only glimpsed, in fragments through Edmund's careful words, and the Duke's own guarded silences. She did not know, standing there in the moonlight beside a man she barely understood, that the story of their marriage was only just beginning, and that the walls surrounding his heart, though thick and carefully constructed, were not entirely without cracks. Cracks that, in time, she might find a way to reach through, if she was patient enough and brave enough to try. Morning arrived at Dellamoor with a quiet chill that settled over the castle like a familiar guest. Elena woke in the grand chambers now meant to be shared, though the other side of the bed remained untouched. The Duke had already risen before dawn, a habit she would soon learn was unbreakable, no matter the season or occasion. She dressed quickly, eager to understand the rhythm of a household that would now define the rest of her days. Grace met her in the corridor, offering a warm smile and a small nod of approval at Elena's simple choice of attire. "His Grace has already gone to the eastern fields," Grace explained as they walked together toward the breakfast hall. "He inspects the estate every morning before the sun is fully risen. It is one of the few habits that has never changed." Does he always work so early? Elena asked, curious about the man she had married but still barely knew. Grace nodded. Since he was young, though it became more pronounced after certain events in his past. Grace paused, clearly choosing her next words with care. Forgive me, my lady. It is not my place to speak of such matters. Elena did not push further, though her curiosity about the Duke's past continued to grow with each passing day. She had learned enough from Edmund, and now from Grace, to understand that something significant had shaped the man he had become. Something that had transformed whatever warmth he once possessed into the guarded coldness the entire region now associated with his name. Breakfast that morning was a quiet affair, as most meals seemed to be within the walls of Dellamoor. The Duke arrived partway through, his boots still carrying traces of the morning fields, his expression as composed as ever, though Elena noticed the faint marks of fatigue beneath his eyes. "Good morning," she offered, testing the waters of conversation. "Good morning," he replied, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," she said. "Though I confess I am still adjusting to the size of this castle. I fear I may become lost within its corridors before I learn my way properly." A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close enough that Elena noticed it immediately. "Grace can arrange for someone to guide you through the estate today, if you wish. It would be beneficial for you to understand the full scope of what you now oversee as Duchess." Elena appreciated the practicality in his suggestion, even if it lacked any warmth beyond simple duty. "I would like that," she said. The Duke nodded, returning his attention to his meal, and Elena understood that their conversation, brief as it was, had reached its natural conclusion. She had learned quickly that he was not a man given to lingering discussions, preferring efficiency in speech, just as he seemed to prefer efficiency in every other aspect of his life. Later that day, as promised, Grace arranged for Elena to tour the full estate, introducing her to the various members of staff, who kept Dellamoor functioning with quiet precision. Elena met the head cook, a stern woman named Margaret Whitfield who ruled her kitchen with unwavering authority, and the stable master, a gentle giant of a man who spoke more fondly of his horses than of most people he encountered. Throughout the tour, Elena noticed something that surprised her deeply. Despite the Duke's cold reputation, the staff spoke of him with genuine respect and, in many cases, real affection. They described a man who paid fair wages, who ensured no family within his employ ever went without necessities, who quietly resolved disputes without ever raising his voice or resorting to cruelty. "He is stern," one of the younger maids admitted as she helped Elena become familiar with the household linens, "but he has never once been unkind to any of us. When my father fell ill last winter, His Grace paid for the finest physician in the region without being asked, and never once mentioned it afterward." Elena filed these small revelations away carefully, each one adding another layer to the complicated portrait forming in her mind. The Duke the world feared and gossiped about was clearly not the same man who quietly ensured his household staff were cared for, without seeking any recognition for his generosity. As the days turned into weeks, Elena began establishing her own routines within the castle. She spent mornings walking through the gardens with Edmund, learning about the various plants and flowers that thrived within Dellamoor's grounds. She spent afternoons in the kitchen with Margaret Whitfield, slowly earning the cook's respect through genuine curiosity, rather than the entitled demands the staff had perhaps expected from a woman of her new station. She also began noticing small changes within the household dynamics, where once the staff moved through their duties with careful, measured caution, always slightly braced for the Duke's disapproval, they now seemed to relax slightly whenever Elena was present. She had a way of easing tension simply through her presence, offering genuine gratitude for small kindnesses, remembering names and personal details that others of her station might have overlooked entirely. One afternoon, while walking through the eastern corridor, Elena overheard a heated discussion between two staff members regarding a scheduling conflict that threatened to disrupt preparations for an upcoming visit from a neighboring noble family. Rather than simply passing by, as many in her position might have done, Elena paused to listen, then offered a solution that satisfied both parties, drawing on her own experience managing the constant small crises that had defined her life within the Ashworth household. Word of her quiet competence spread quickly among the staff, and within a month, Elena found herself trusted with responsibilities far beyond what she had initially expected. She began overseeing the household budget alongside Grace, learning the intricate details of managing an estate as vast as Dellamoor, discovering a natural talent for organization and problem-solving that had never been given the opportunity to flourish within her family's home. The Duke noticed these changes as well, though he rarely commented on them directly. Elena would occasionally catch him observing her from across a room, his expression unreadable, yet somehow less guarded than it had been during their first days together. She began to wonder if perhaps he was as curious about her as she remained about him, both of them slowly learning to navigate a marriage built on necessity rather than choice. Their conversations, though still brief, began carrying more weight and substance. During one particular evening meal, the Duke asked about her childhood, a question that caught Elena entirely off guard. "Why do you ask?" she said, unable to hide her surprise. "I find myself curious," he admitted, his tone carrying a rare hint of vulnerability. "About the woman my family so easily dismissed. I wish to understand what shaped you into someone capable of managing an estate as complex as this one within mere weeks of arriving." Elena considered her answer carefully. "My family never saw much use for me beyond serving as a quiet presence in the background. My sisters received tutors and dance instructors and every advantage society could offer. I received very little, so I learned to observe instead. I learned to notice details others overlooked, to solve problems quietly before they became larger issues that required attention." The Duke listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "That is not a weakness," he said finally. "That is precisely the kind of strength that endures long after charm and beauty fade." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, unexpected and unfamiliar. She had spent so many years believing herself unremarkable that hearing genuine respect from a man as guarded as the Duke felt like something precious, something she wanted to hold on to carefully. "You speak as though you understand something about being overlooked yourself," she said gently, testing the boundaries of their still fragile connection. The Duke's expression shifted, the walls rising slightly once more, though not entirely. "Everyone carries their own burdens," he said, his tone closing the subject firmly. "Some simply learn to hide them better than others." Elena did not press further, sensing that whatever pain lay beneath his carefully constructed composure was not yet ready to be shared. But she found herself more determined than ever to understand him fully, to discover what had happened, to transform a man capable of such quiet generosity into someone the entire region now feared for his coldness. As autumn settled over Dellamoor, bringing with it cooler winds and the first hints of frost across the gardens, Elena found herself growing genuinely fond of her new home, despite its imposing size and the mysteries still surrounding her husband. She had begun to feel, for the first time in her life, that she belonged somewhere, that her presence mattered beyond simply fulfilling an obligation or completing a transaction between families. Yet even as this fragile sense of belonging grew, Elena remained aware of the shadows still lingering at the edges of her new life. The staff's careful avoidance of certain topics, the way Edmund's voice had lowered when discussing the Duke's past, the flicker of old pain that occasionally crossed the Duke's face during unguarded moments, all of it suggested that whatever history shaped him remained unresolved, waiting somewhere in the depths of Dellamoor's ancient walls, ready to resurface when least expected. Elena did not know it yet, but the peace she had begun building within these walls was about to be tested in ways she could not have anticipated, as figures from both her past and the Duke's began to draw closer, threatening to unravel the fragile trust they had only just begun to build between them. Winter arrived at Dellamoor sooner than expected that year, blanketing the gardens Elena had grown fond of in a thick layer of frost. She stood by the window of her chambers one morning, watching Edmund carefully wrap the more delicate plants in cloth to protect them from the cold, and felt a strange sense of contentment settle over her, one she had rarely experienced during her years in the Ashworth household. That contentment, however, was interrupted by news that arrived one afternoon in the form of a letter, delivered by a messenger who had traveled a considerable distance to reach the castle. Grace brought the letter to Elena in the study, her expression carefully neutral, though Elena sensed immediately that something significant was contained within its pages. "This arrived for you, my lady," Grace said, handing over the sealed envelope. "From your mother." Elena's stomach tightened as she recognized the familiar wax seal of the Ashworth family crest. She had not heard from her family since the wedding, and she had assumed, perhaps naively, that their silence meant they had finally released her from whatever expectations they still held. She opened the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting that filled the page. Her mother's words were warm on the surface, expressing pride in Elena's new position and asking after her well-being. But Elena had spent enough years learning to read between the lines of her mother's carefully constructed sentences to understand the true purpose behind the letter. Buried within the pleasant inquiries was a request, delicately worded but unmistakable in its intent. Lady Beatrice wished to visit Dellamoor, along with Margaret and Charlotte, ostensibly to reconnect with Elena and celebrate her new position. But Elena understood immediately that the true purpose was far less sentimental. Her family had likely realized, in the months since the wedding, the true extent of the Duke's wealth and influence, and now sought to secure whatever advantages they could through their renewed connection to Dellamoor. Elena sat with the letter for a long while, uncertain how to proceed. Part of her wanted to refuse the visit entirely, to protect the fragile peace she had built within these walls from the complications her family inevitably brought with them. But another part of her, the part that still carried the hope of a young girl who had once wished desperately for her family's approval, wondered if perhaps this visit could be an opportunity to finally be seen by them, truly seen, rather than simply overlooked or dismissed. That evening, she brought the matter to the Duke's attention during their evening meal, uncertain how he would respond to the prospect of her family's presence within his household. "My mother wishes to visit," Elena explained carefully, watching his expression for any sign of reaction. "Along with my sisters. She claims it is to celebrate my new position, though I suspect there is more to it than genuine sentiment." The Duke's expression remained composed, though Elena noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, a subtle sign of displeasure he seemed unable to fully conceal. "I am aware of your family's history," he said carefully. "I do not wish to make this decision for you, but I will say that you owe them nothing, regardless of what obligations society might suggest otherwise." Elena appreciated his honesty, even as she wrestled with her own conflicted feelings on the matter. "I know I owe them nothing," she said quietly, "but perhaps I owe myself the chance to see if things could be different now. Perhaps distance and time have changed something within them." The Duke studied her for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "If that is what you wish, they may visit. But know this, Elena, if they attempt to take advantage of your position or cause you distress in any way, I will not hesitate to intervene." Elena felt an unexpected warmth at his words, a protectiveness she had not anticipated from a man who had built such careful walls around himself. "Thank you," she said softly. The visit was arranged for 2 weeks later, giving Elena time to prepare herself mentally for whatever her family's true intentions might be. As the day approached, she found herself growing increasingly anxious, uncertain how she would navigate the complicated dynamics that had defined her entire childhood. When the carriage finally arrived, carrying Lady Beatrice, Margaret, and Charlotte, Elena stood in the courtyard to greet them, her composure carefully maintained despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Her mother emerged first, her expression carefully arranged into one of warm affection, though Elena noticed the calculating glint in her eyes as she took in the grandeur of Dellamoor's courtyard. "Elena, my dear," Lady Beatrice exclaimed, embracing her daughter with practiced enthusiasm. "You look wonderful. Marriage clearly agrees with you." Margaret and Charlotte followed, their greetings similarly warm on the surface, though Elena could sense the underlying tension in their smiles, the barely concealed envy at the life their sister now led. The visit began pleasantly enough, with Elena giving her family a tour of the castle grounds, watching as their expressions shifted from polite interest to poorly disguised astonishment at the sheer scale and beauty of Dellamoor's estate. Lady Beatrice's questions grew increasingly pointed as the tour progressed, inquiring about the extent of the Duke's holdings, the various properties he owned beyond the main estate, the connections he maintained within the royal court. Elena answered these questions carefully, growing more aware with each passing moment that her mother's interest had little to do with genuine curiosity about her daughter's new life, and everything to do with assessing how this connection might benefit the family's declining fortunes. During dinner that evening, the true purpose of the visit became increasingly clear. Lady Beatrice steered the conversation toward the family's ongoing financial difficulties, hinting not so subtly at the possibility of Elena using her new influence to secure a loan or investment from the Duke on the family's behalf. "Elena, dear, surely your husband would be willing to assist your own family in these difficult times," Lady Beatrice said, her tone carrying the same manipulative sweetness Elena remembered from countless childhood interactions. "We are, after all, connected now through marriage. Elena felt her stomach tighten uncomfortably, aware of the Duke's presence at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he listened to the conversation unfold. Before Elena could formulate a response, the Duke spoke, his voice carrying the same cold authority Elena had witnessed during their first meeting. "Lady Ashworth," he said calmly, "I believe you misunderstand the nature of this marriage. Elena is my wife, not a means through which your family might resolve its financial mismanagement." The table fell silent, Lady Beatrice's face flushing with embarrassment and barely concealed anger. "Your Grace, I only meant that families should support one another during difficult times." "Family," the Duke replied, his tone growing sharper, "should have supported Elena long before now, rather than treating her as an afterthought for the majority of her life. I am well aware of how she was regarded within your household, Lady Ashworth. I do not intend to allow that same treatment to continue under my roof, in any form." Margaret and Charlotte exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unprepared for the Duke's direct confrontation of their mother's manipulative tactics. Elena, meanwhile, felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Embarrassment at having her family's true nature exposed so openly, and gratitude that someone had finally spoken the truth she had carried silently for so many years. Lady Beatrice, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, attempted to salvage the conversation with a forced laugh. "Your Grace, I simply worry for my daughter's happiness, as any mother would." The Duke's expression remained unmoved. "If that were true, Lady Ashworth, you would have shown greater concern for her happiness during the many years she spent overlooked within your household. I suggest we conclude this conversation before it damages the relationship further." The remainder of the visit passed with considerably more tension than before. Lady Beatrice's attempts at reconnecting with Elena, feeling increasingly hollow, in light of the Duke's pointed observations. When the family finally departed the following morning, their farewells were noticeably more subdued, the earlier performance of warmth abandoned entirely, in favor of barely concealed resentment. As the carriage disappeared down the winding road away from Dellamoor, Elena stood beside the Duke in the courtyard, processing the events of the past 2 days. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for their behavior. I should have anticipated their true intentions before agreeing to this visit." "You have nothing to apologize for," the Duke replied, his tone softening slightly as he turned to face her. "Their behavior reflects entirely on them, not on you. I simply could not allow it to continue unaddressed." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for the source of the protectiveness he had shown so unexpectedly during dinner. "Why did you defend me so fiercely?" she asked. "You barely know me." The Duke's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where her family's carriage had disappeared. "Perhaps I know you better than you realize," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight Elena did not yet fully understand. "Perhaps I have been paying closer attention than you might expect." Before Elena could ask him to elaborate, he turned and walked back toward the castle, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard, her mind racing with questions about what exactly he meant, and what history existed between them that she had not yet uncovered. That night, as Elena lay awake in her chambers, she found herself replaying the Duke's words over and over in her mind. "Perhaps I have been paying closer attention than you might expect." The phrase suggested something deeper than simple curiosity, something that hinted at a connection between them that predated their wedding entirely. She did not yet know how significant those words would prove to be, or how much they would reshape her understanding of why the Duke had chosen her, of all people, to become his wife. But she sensed, lying there in the darkness of her chambers, that the answers she sought were closer than she had ever imagined, hidden somewhere within the walls of Dellamoor, waiting to be discovered. The weeks following her family's departure brought a noticeable shift in the relationship between Elena and the Duke. Where once their conversations had remained carefully guarded, both parties measuring their words with caution, something had loosened between them since the confrontation with Lady Beatrice. The Duke began seeking Elena's company more frequently, inviting her to join him during his morning inspections of the estate, a routine she had previously believed belonged to him alone. Elena found herself genuinely enjoying these mornings, walking alongside him through the fields and pastures that stretched across Dellamoor's vast territory, listening as he explained the various responsibilities that came with managing such an extensive estate. She noticed, during these walks, that he spoke with genuine passion about the land and the people who depended on it, a warmth that contradicted everything society believed about his character. You care deeply for this place, Elena observed one crisp morning as they walked along the edge of a frost-covered field. The Duke nodded, his gaze sweeping across the landscape with quiet pride. My father taught me that a title means nothing without responsibility attached to it. This land, these people, they depend on decisions made within these walls. I cannot afford to treat that responsibility lightly. Elena considered his words carefully, recognizing in them the same sense of duty that had shaped her own approach to managing the household staff and resolving their various concerns. Perhaps that is why your household staff speaks so highly of you, she said, despite what the rest of society believes. The Duke's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. What does the rest of society believe, exactly? Elena hesitated, uncertain whether to share the full extent of the rumors she had heard since arriving at Dellamoor. That you are cold, she admitted finally, distant, incapable of warmth or genuine feeling. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Perhaps that reputation serves a purpose, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight Elena had not heard before. Perhaps it is easier to be perceived as cold than to explain the reasons behind certain choices I have made. Elena's curiosity intensified at his words, sensing that he was finally on the verge of revealing something significant about his past. What reasons? She asked gently, careful not to push too forcefully against walls that had taken years to construct. The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression conflicted in a way Elena had never witnessed before. Years ago, he began slowly, I was engaged to another woman. Her name was Cordelia. I believed, at the time, that I loved her deeply, that our future together was certain. Elena remained silent, sensing that interrupting now would only cause him to retreat back behind his familiar walls. She came from a family with considerable ambitions, the Duke continued, his voice growing quieter. I discovered, quite by accident, that her affection for me was entirely calculated, a means through which her family hoped to secure greater influence and wealth. She had been carrying on a secret arrangement with another suitor throughout our entire engagement, one whose family offered even greater advantages than my own. Elena's heart ached at the pain evident beneath his carefully measured words. I am sorry, she said softly. The betrayal itself was not what changed me most, the Duke continued, his gaze distant as though reliving the memory. It was the realization that I had been so easily deceived, that I had allowed myself to trust someone so completely, without recognizing the calculation behind her every word and gesture. After that, I made a decision. I would no longer allow sentiment to guide my judgment. I would approach every relationship, every decision, with careful logic rather than vulnerable trust. Elena finally understood the true source of the walls he had built around himself. Walls constructed not from natural coldness, but from a wound so deep it had reshaped his entire approach to life and relationships. Is that why you chose me? She asked quietly. Because you believed I was incapable of the same calculated deception? The Duke's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained guarded. That was part of it, he admitted, but it was not the only reason. What was the other reason? Elena pressed gently. The Duke hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to reveal more than he had originally intended. I had seen you before, he said finally. Years ago, at a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance of our families. You were young then, barely more than a girl, standing quietly at the edge of the room while your sisters commanded everyone's attention. Elena's breath caught, surprised by this revelation. I do not remember meeting you. We did not formally meet, the Duke clarified. I observed you from a distance. I watched as you quietly helped a young servant who had spilled a tray of refreshments, calming her distress and helping clean the mess, before anyone else noticed the mistake had occurred. No one thanked you for your kindness. No one even seemed to notice what you had done. Elena felt a lump forming in her throat, moved by the memory of a moment she had long forgotten. A small act of compassion that had apparently left a lasting impression on a man she had not even realized was watching. I never forgot that moment, the Duke continued, his voice carrying an unexpected vulnerability. In a world full of people performing kindness for recognition, you offered it quietly, expecting nothing in return. When the opportunity arose to consider a marriage between our families, I specifically requested that you be the daughter presented to me, though your family assumed I would naturally prefer one of your sisters. Elena stood in stunned silence, processing this revelation that completely reshaped her understanding of the events that had brought her to Dellamoor. "You chose me deliberately," she said slowly. "It was never a random selection made in that grand hall." "No," the Duke confirmed. "Though I admit my words that evening were perhaps harsher than necessary. I wished to observe how your family would react, whether they would attempt to redirect my attention toward your sisters despite my clear request. Their reaction only confirmed what I had already suspected about how poorly they valued you." Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions swirling within her, gratitude for finally understanding the truth behind her marriage, but also a lingering hurt at the memory of being called the rejected one in front of her entire family, even if the Duke's intentions behind those words had been far more calculated than cruel. "Why did you not simply tell me this from the beginning?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. The Duke's expression grew somber. "Because revealing such feelings requires a vulnerability I have not allowed myself since Cordelia's betrayal," he admitted. "It is far easier to maintain distance, to protect myself from the possibility of being hurt again in the same manner. But watching you these past months, observing your kindness toward the staff, your resilience in the face of your family's continued manipulation, I find myself questioning whether the walls I built have protected me, or simply prevented me from experiencing something I did not realize I was still capable of feeling." Elena's heart raced at his words, recognizing in them an admission that went far beyond simple practicality or calculated marriage arrangements. "What are you saying, exactly?" she asked softly. The Duke stepped closer, his usual composure faltering slightly as he searched for the right words. "I am saying that what began as a marriage of convenience has become something I did not anticipate," he said finally. "I find myself caring for you in ways I promised myself I would never allow again." Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, moved by the vulnerability evident in his admission, a vulnerability she suspected very few people had ever witnessed from a man so carefully guarded against the world. "I feel something similar," she admitted quietly, "though I confess I do not fully understand what to make of it yet." The Duke reached out, gently taking her hand in his, a small gesture that carried enormous significance, given his usual careful avoidance of physical contact. "We do not need to understand it fully right now," he said softly. "Perhaps it is enough to simply acknowledge that something exists between us, worth exploring further, without the pressure of defining it immediately." Elena nodded, grateful for his patience, for the careful way he approached this delicate moment between them. As they stood together in the frost-covered field, the morning sun beginning to burn away the last remnants of winter chill, Elena felt a profound shift within herself. A recognition that the life she had once believed would be defined entirely by rejection and obligation was transforming into something far more meaningful than she had ever dared to hope for. Yet even as this fragile connection deepened between them, neither Elena nor the Duke could have anticipated the challenges still waiting on the horizon. Challenges that would test the foundation of trust they had only just begun to build, threatening to unravel everything they had worked so carefully to construct together. The revelation between Elena and the Duke marked a turning point in their marriage, one that brought a newfound closeness neither had anticipated when they first stood together in that grand hall so many months ago. Their mornings continued to include shared walks across the estate, though now their conversations carried a warmth previously absent, small moments of genuine laughter breaking through the careful formality that had once defined their interactions. The tension that had once seemed permanently etched into his shoulders gradually eased. His interactions with the household staff grew slightly less formal, occasional moments of genuine warmth slipping through the composed exterior he had maintained for so long. Even Grace commented on the transformation during one of their quiet mornings together in the kitchen. "I have not seen His Grace this at ease since before his father's passing," Grace remarked, kneading dough for the morning bread with practiced efficiency. "You have brought something back to this household that had been missing for a very long time, my lady." Elena appreciated the sentiment, though a part of her remained cautious, aware that happiness so newly discovered could be fragile, easily disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. That caution proved warranted when, several weeks later, an unexpected visitor arrived at Dellamoor, one whose presence threatened to unravel the careful trust Elena and the Duke had only just begun to build. The visitor arrived on a gray afternoon, her carriage bearing a crest Elena did not immediately recognize. Grace informed her that the visitor was a widow named Lady Cordelia Ashcombe, a name that struck Elena with sudden recognition. This was the same Cordelia who had once broken the Duke's trust so completely, the woman whose betrayal had shaped the walls he had spent years constructing around his heart. Elena's stomach tightened with unease as she prepared to greet the unexpected guest, uncertain what purpose could possibly bring this woman back into the Duke's life after so many years of silence. When Elena entered the drawing room where Lady Cordelia waited, she found herself facing a woman of striking beauty, her dark hair elegantly arranged, her expression carrying a practiced grace that Elena immediately recognized as calculated rather than genuine. "Lady Elena," Cordelia said, rising gracefully to greet her with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I hope you will forgive this unannounced visit. I was traveling through the region and could not resist the opportunity to reconnect with an old acquaintance." Elena maintained her composure, though internally she felt every instinct warning her against trusting this woman's carefully constructed pleasantries. "Of course, Lady Cordelia," she replied evenly. "Please, sit. I will have refreshments brought immediately." As they waited for the Duke to be informed of his unexpected visitor, Cordelia engaged Elena in conversation that seemed innocent enough on the surface, questions about the estate, comments on the beauty of the surrounding countryside, yet Elena sensed an underlying purpose behind every carefully chosen word. "You must find life at Dellamoor quite different from what you were accustomed to," Cordelia observed, her tone carrying a subtle condescension that Elena recognized immediately from years of enduring similar treatment from her own family. Managing an estate of this size requires considerable skill and experience, qualities that come from years of proper training and exposure to noble society. Elena refused to allow the comment to unsettle her. "I have found that genuine care for the people around you often accomplishes more than years of formal training," she replied smoothly. "Though I appreciate your concern, Lady Cordelia." Cordelia's smile tightened slightly at Elena's composed response, clearly having expected an easier target for her subtle manipulation. Before she could continue, the Duke entered the room, his expression immediately shifting into something guarded and cautious upon recognizing his unexpected guest. "Cordelia," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Elena had grown accustomed to over recent weeks. "What brings you to Dellamoor after all this time?" Cordelia rose gracefully, extending a hand that the Duke did not move to take. "Edmund," she said, using his given name with a familiarity that made Elena's stomach twist uncomfortably. "I heard of your marriage, and simply wish to offer my congratulations in person, along with my condolences regarding my husband's recent passing. I find myself alone in the world now, seeking to reconnect with old friendships that once meant a great deal to me." The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena noticed the subtle tension returning to his shoulders. Walls she had believed were finally beginning to crumble, suddenly reinforced by this unexpected presence from his past. "I am sorry for your loss," the Duke said formally, though his tone lacked any genuine warmth. "However, I fail to understand what purpose this visit serves, beyond simple condolences." Cordelia's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of calculation crossing her features before she composed herself once more. "I had hoped, perhaps, that enough time had passed for us to move beyond old grievances," she said carefully. "I made mistakes in our past, Edmund, mistakes I have long regretted. I only wished for the opportunity to make amends, perhaps even rebuild something of what we once shared, in whatever capacity circumstances now allow." Elena felt her heart clench at the implications behind Cordelia's carefully chosen words, the subtle suggestion that she hoped to reclaim some portion of the Duke's affection, despite his current marriage. She glanced toward the Duke, searching his expression for any sign of how he intended to respond to this unexpected proposition. "Whatever we once shared ended the moment I discovered your true intentions," the Duke replied, his voice hardening with each word. "I have moved beyond that chapter of my life entirely. I suggest you do the same." Cordelia's composure faltered slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a direct rejection. "Surely you do not intend to remain devoted to a marriage born purely from convenience," she said, her gaze flickering toward Elena with poorly concealed disdain. "We both know the circumstances surrounding your union with Lady Elena. Surely genuine feeling cannot have developed so quickly between you." The Duke's expression grew fierce, a protectiveness Elena had witnessed only once before, during the confrontation with her own family. "You know nothing of what exists between myself and my wife," he said sharply. "I suggest you reconsider the purpose of your visit before you overstay whatever welcome remained upon your arrival." Cordelia's mask finally slipped entirely, revealing the calculating desperation beneath her polished exterior. "Edmund, please," she said, her voice losing its earlier composure. "I have nothing left. My husband's estate was heavily indebted, and I find myself with nowhere else to turn. I thought perhaps, given our history, you might be willing to offer some form of assistance." Elena finally understood the true purpose behind Cordelia's unexpected visit, recognizing the desperate manipulation for what it truly was. This was not a woman seeking reconciliation out of genuine affection, but a woman seeking financial security through whatever means remained available to her, including the exploitation of old wounds and past relationships. The Duke's expression hardened further, any remaining sympathy evaporating entirely at this admission. "I will not be manipulated twice by the same person, Cordelia," he said firmly. "I wish you well in resolving your financial difficulties, but I cannot and will not offer assistance under these circumstances. I suggest you seek support from your own family or the connections you cultivated during your marriage." Cordelia's expression twisted with barely concealed anger, her carefully maintained grace abandoned entirely. "You will regret this," she said coldly, her earlier pleasant demeanor replaced by something far more bitter. "Both of you will regret dismissing me so easily." With that, she gathered her belongings and departed the room with as much dignity as she could muster, leaving behind a heavy silence that lingered long after her carriage had disappeared down the winding road, away from Dellamoor. Elena and the Duke stood together in the aftermath of this confrontation, both processing the implications of what had just occurred. "Are you all right?" Elena asked gently, watching the tension gradually ease from his shoulders. The Duke nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "I apologize that you had to witness that," he said quietly. "I had hoped that chapter of my life was permanently closed." Elena reached out, taking his hand in a gesture that mirrored the comfort he had offered her during their earlier conversation in the frost-covered field. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said softly. "Her actions reflect entirely on her character, not on you." The Duke studied her expression carefully, searching for any sign of doubt or insecurity that Cordelia's visit might have planted within her. "Do her words concern you?" he asked. "Regarding the nature of our marriage?" Elena considered the question honestly before responding. "I trust what has grown between us," she said finally. "Regardless of how our marriage began, I believe in what we have built since then." The Duke's expression softened with visible relief, pulling Elena into a gentle embrace that spoke volumes about the trust developing between them, stronger now than any manipulation or bitter accusation from his past could hope to unravel. Yet as they stood together, finding comfort in each other's presence, neither could have anticipated that Cordelia's parting words carried a threat far more significant than either of them realized, one that would soon test their newfound bond in ways neither had prepared for. In the weeks following Cordelia's departure, life at Dellamoor seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm, though Elena remained privately watchful, unable to shake the unease left behind by the woman's parting threat. She said nothing of her lingering concern to the Duke, not wishing to burden him further with worries that might amount to nothing more than empty bitterness from a woman who had lost her leverage and departed in frustration. The Duke, for his part, seemed determined to prove that Cordelia's visit had changed nothing between himself and Elena. If anything, the encounter appeared to have strengthened his resolve to build something genuine within their marriage. He began seeking Elena's company even more frequently, sharing meals together that stretched into lengthy conversations, walking with her through the gardens even during the colder afternoons, when frost still clung stubbornly to the ground. Elena found herself falling into an easy companionship with him, one built on mutual respect and a growing affection neither of them had anticipated when their marriage first began. She learned about his father, a man who had taught him the importance of responsibility from a young age, and about his mother, who had passed when the Duke was still a boy, leaving behind a void that had shaped much of his early character. In turn, Elena shared more about her own childhood, the years spent feeling invisible within her family's grand estate, the small moments of kindness she had learned to offer others, even when none was extended toward her. The Duke listened with genuine attentiveness, occasionally asking questions that revealed just how closely he had been paying attention to every detail she shared. One evening, as they sat together near the fireplace in the study, the Duke turned to Elena with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost hesitant despite his usual confidence. I have been considering something, he said carefully, regarding our marriage and what it has become. Elena felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. What have you been considering? When I chose you, the Duke continued, I told myself I was simply making a practical decision, selecting someone I believed would prove capable and resilient. But I find myself needing to be honest with you now, about what has developed since then. Elena remained silent, allowing him the space to continue without interruption. I have fallen in love with you, Elena, the Duke said finally, his voice carrying a vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the cold reputation society had assigned to him. Not out of obligation or convenience, but genuinely, completely. I did not believe myself capable of such feeling again after Cordelia's betrayal, yet here I find myself, unable to deny what has grown within my heart since your arrival at Dellamoor. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity evident in his admission. I love you as well, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. I did not expect to find such happiness within a marriage that began under such strange circumstances, yet here we are. The Duke reached for her hand, his expression filled with a warmth Elena had never witnessed from him during their earliest interactions. Then let us build something lasting from this foundation, he said, regardless of whatever challenges may arise from those who wish to see us fail. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door, Grace entering with an expression of visible concern that immediately shifted the mood of the room. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, my lady, Grace said, her voice carrying an urgency that put both Elena and the Duke on immediate alert. A messenger has arrived with troubling news. It seems Lady Cordelia has been spreading rumors throughout the neighboring estates, claiming that your marriage was arranged under fraudulent circumstances, and that His Grace intends to seek an annulment in order to pursue a more advantageous union. Elena's heart sank at this revelation, understanding immediately the malicious purpose behind Cordelia's fabricated claims. Such rumors, if believed by the wrong people, could cause significant damage to both her reputation and the stability of her marriage, particularly among the noble circles who valued reputation above almost everything else. The Duke's expression hardened with barely contained anger. This is precisely the kind of manipulation I feared she might attempt, he said grimly. We must address this immediately, before the rumors spread further and cause lasting damage. How do we combat such claims? Elena asked, her voice steady, despite the anxiety building within her. The Duke considered the question carefully before responding. We will host a gathering, he said finally, an event significant enough to demonstrate publicly the genuine nature of our marriage, inviting enough prominent guests that Cordelia's fabricated rumors will be exposed as nothing more than bitter falsehoods. Elena nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of hosting such a significant event, particularly given her limited experience with the elaborate social gatherings that defined noble society. Do you believe this will be enough to silence her claims? She asked. It must be, the Duke replied firmly. We cannot allow her bitterness to unravel everything we have built together. I will not permit her manipulation to succeed a second time. Over the following days, preparations for the gathering consumed much of the household's attention. Elena worked closely with Grace and the rest of the staff to ensure every detail reflected the genuine warmth and stability of her marriage to the Duke, from the careful selection of guests to the elaborate decorations that would transform the Great Hall into a space worthy of Dellamoor's reputation. Throughout these preparations, Elena found herself growing increasingly confident in her role as Duchess, drawing on the skills she had developed during her months managing the estate's daily operations. She approached each decision with careful thought, balancing tradition with her own genuine instincts, creating an event that felt authentic rather than merely performative. The evening of the gathering arrived with a crisp winter chill hanging in the air. The Great Hall of Dellamoor transformed into a warm, inviting space filled with candlelight and carefully arranged floral displays that Edmund had helped cultivate despite the season's challenges. Guests began arriving throughout the early evening, prominent families from across the region, eager to witness firsthand the marriage that had become the subject of such widespread speculation. Elena stood beside the Duke as they greeted their guests, her composure carefully maintained, despite the underlying nervousness she felt at the significance of this evening. The Duke, sensing her anxiety, offered a reassuring squeeze of her hand whenever their guests turned their attention elsewhere, a small gesture of support that helped steady her nerves considerably. As the evening progressed, Elena noticed a shift in the atmosphere among their guests. Initial curiosity and skepticism gradually giving way to genuine warmth as they observed the authentic affection between herself and the Duke. Their interactions throughout the evening, from shared glances across the room to quiet conversations that revealed genuine understanding between them, spoke far more convincingly than any formal declaration could have accomplished. Midway through the evening, as Elena engaged in conversation with several of the neighboring noble families, she noticed Lady Cordelia arriving uninvited, her expression carrying a mixture of desperation and calculated determination. Elena's stomach tightened at the sight of her, aware that whatever confrontation followed would likely determine the ultimate success or failure of their efforts to silence her malicious rumors. Cordelia moved through the crowd with practiced grace, though Elena could see the underlying tension in her posture, the desperate need to salvage whatever advantage she still believed she could extract from this situation. When she finally approached Elena and the Duke, her expression carried a challenge that immediately drew the attention of the surrounding guests. "Edmund," Cordelia said loudly enough for those nearby to hear clearly, "I find it curious that you would host such an elaborate gathering so soon after rumors of your marriage's true nature began circulating. Perhaps you wish to distract from the truth, rather than address it directly." The surrounding guests fell silent, clearly aware of the underlying tension between the three individuals now standing at the center of attention. Elena felt her heart racing, aware that this moment would likely determine whether Cordelia's manipulation succeeded or failed entirely. The Duke's expression remained calm despite the public challenge, his composure a testament to years of careful control. "Cordelia," he said evenly, his voice carrying enough volume to ensure everyone nearby could hear his response clearly. "I believe it is time we addressed your claims directly, in front of witnesses who can attest to the truth." Elena watched as the Duke turned to face the gathered crowd, his expression resolute. Several weeks ago, Lady Cordelia visited Dellamoor, seeking financial assistance following her husband's passing. He announced clearly, "When I declined to provide such assistance, given our complicated history, she chose instead to spread false rumors regarding my marriage, hoping perhaps to force my hand through public embarrassment." Murmurs rippled through the gathered guests, many exchanging glances of surprise and growing understanding at this revelation. Cordelia's expression faltered, clearly not having anticipated such a direct public exposure of her manipulative intentions. "I love my wife," the Duke continued, his voice carrying genuine conviction that silenced any remaining doubt among their guests. "Our marriage began under unusual circumstances, yes, but what has grown between us since then is entirely genuine. I will not allow bitter falsehoods to undermine what Elena and I have built together." The crowd's reaction shifted noticeably, sympathy and respect replacing the earlier curiosity and skepticism that had defined their arrival. Cordelia, recognizing the complete failure of her scheme, offered a final glare toward Elena, before turning and departing the gathering entirely, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious humiliation. As the evening continued, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude, watching as their guests' attitudes shifted decisively in their favor, genuine warmth replacing the earlier speculation that had threatened to undermine everything she and the Duke had built together. Yet even as this particular challenge resolved successfully, Elena understood that their journey together was far from finished, with new obstacles and revelations still waiting to test the strength of the bond they continued to build with each passing day. The weeks following the gathering brought a renewed sense of stability to Dellamoor, the public exposure of Cordelia's manipulation, having thoroughly silenced any remaining doubts among the region's noble families regarding the authenticity of Elena and the Duke's marriage. Invitations began arriving from neighboring estates, requests for Elena and the Duke to attend various social functions, a clear indication that their standing within noble society had not only recovered but strengthened considerably. Elena found herself adapting quickly to these new social demands, drawing on the confidence she had developed over the previous months to navigate conversations and gatherings that would have overwhelmed her during her earlier years within the Ashworth household. The Duke remained a steady presence throughout these events, his quiet support evident in the way he would occasionally catch her eye across a crowded room, offering silent reassurance whenever she needed it most. Despite this newfound stability, Elena noticed the Duke growing increasingly preoccupied during the weeks that followed, his attention frequently drawn toward correspondence that arrived from the capital, his expression thoughtful whenever he reviewed these particular letters. She did not press him regarding the nature of this correspondence, trusting that he would share the details when he felt ready to do so. That moment arrived one evening as they sat together in the study, the fireplace casting warm light across the room, while snow gathered steadily outside the windows. The Duke set aside the letter he had been reading, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately captured Elena's full attention. "I have received word from the royal court," he said carefully, choosing his words with evident thought. "It seems there are those within certain circles who question the legitimacy of my recent public declarations regarding our marriage, suggesting that my defense of you during the gathering was simply a calculated performance rather than genuine sentiment." Elena felt a flicker of concern at this revelation. "What does this mean for us?" The Duke sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of visible frustration. "There are those who believe I have been weakened by sentiment, that my judgment regarding matters of state and estate management may be compromised by what they perceive as an unusual attachment to a wife they still consider beneath my station, despite everything we have accomplished together." Elena felt a familiar sting at these words, old wounds from years of being considered lesser than her sisters resurfacing unexpectedly. "Do you believe that as well?" she asked quietly, unable to fully mask the vulnerability in her voice. The Duke's expression softened immediately, recognizing the pain his words had inadvertently caused. "Never," he said firmly, reaching for her hand across the small distance between them. "You are the finest thing that has happened to me since my father's passing. I care nothing for the opinions of those who cannot see your true worth, but I fear their influence may create complications for our future, particularly regarding certain responsibilities I hold within the royal court." "What kind of complications?" Elena asked, her curiosity mixing with growing concern. The Duke hesitated before continuing. "There is a position," he explained, "one of considerable influence within the Royal Advisory Council, that has been offered to me. However, certain members of the court have suggested that my suitability for this role depends on demonstrating stronger alignment with traditional noble values, values that some believe our marriage does not adequately represent." Elena understood immediately the implication behind his careful words. "They wish for you to distance yourself from me," she said, her voice steady despite the pain building within her chest. The Duke's grip on her hand tightened. "I will not do that," he said firmly. "Regardless of what opportunities or advancement such a decision might provide, I have made my choice, Elena, and I have no intention of allowing outdated prejudices to dictate the course of our marriage." Despite his reassurance, Elena could not shake the growing unease that settled within her over the following days. She understood the significance of the position being offered to the Duke, recognizing that such advisory roles carried influence that extended far beyond mere personal ambition, potentially affecting the well-being of countless people across the kingdom through policies and decisions shaped at the highest levels of governance. She began to wonder, despite the Duke's firm reassurances, whether her presence in his life might ultimately cost him opportunities that could benefit not only himself, but the broader community he was responsible for protecting and serving. This concern weighed heavily on her mind as she continued her daily responsibilities throughout the estate. The earlier contentment she had found within these walls now tinged with a growing anxiety about what the future might hold. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens with Edmund, Elena found herself sharing these concerns, seeking the wisdom of a man who had witnessed decades of life within Dellamoor's walls. "Do you believe I am holding him back?" she asked quietly, watching as Edmund carefully tended to the winter blooms that somehow managed to survive the season's harsh conditions. Edmund paused his work, considering her question with evident thoughtfulness. "My lady," he said finally, "His Grace has always possessed a strong sense of duty, sometimes to his own detriment, but I have also watched him struggle for years under the weight of expectations that never accounted for his own happiness or genuine desires. Since your arrival, I have witnessed a transformation in him that speaks to something far more valuable than any position or title could provide." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about Edmund's perspective given his years of observing the Duke's life. "Before you arrived," Edmund continued, "His Grace moved through each day with a kind of emptiness, fulfilling his responsibilities with precision, but without any genuine joy behind his actions. Since your marriage, I have watched him laugh more freely, engage more warmly with the household staff, approach his responsibilities with a renewed sense of purpose that extends beyond mere duty." "Whatever position the royal court offers, my lady," I do not believe it could ever replace what you have brought back into his life." Elena felt tears gathering at Edmund's words, grateful for his honest perspective despite her lingering concerns. "Thank you, Edmund," she said softly. "Your words mean more to me than you likely realize." That evening, as Elena prepared for dinner, she made the decision to address her concerns directly with the Duke, understanding that avoiding the difficult conversation would only allow her anxieties to fester unresolved. She found him in his study, reviewing correspondence that likely pertained to the ongoing situation with the royal court. "I have been thinking about the position being offered to you," she said, drawing his attention away from the documents spread across his desk. The Duke's expression grew attentive, sensing the seriousness behind her tone. "What have you been thinking exactly?" Elena took a steadying breath before continuing. "I do not wish to be the reason you sacrifice an opportunity that could benefit countless people across the kingdom," she said carefully. "If accepting this position requires distancing yourself from our marriage in some capacity, perhaps we should consider what compromise might allow you to fulfill your responsibilities without unnecessary sacrifice." The Duke's expression shifted into something between surprise and mild frustration. "Elena," he said firmly, "are you suggesting that I should consider ending our marriage for the sake of political advancement?" "No," Elena clarified quickly, "though I wonder if there is a path forward that satisfies both your responsibilities to the kingdom and our commitment to each other." The Duke rose from his desk, moving to stand directly in front of her, his expression carrying a conviction Elena had rarely witnessed from him before. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "I did not marry you simply to abandon that commitment the moment external pressures suggested an alternative path might prove more advantageous. If the royal court cannot accept my marriage as it stands, then I have no interest in serving within their advisory council. My responsibilities to this estate, to the people who depend on Dellamoor's stability, will always take precedence over ambitions that require sacrificing my own happiness and integrity." Elena felt overwhelming relief and gratitude at his words, recognizing the depth of his commitment to their marriage, despite the significant opportunity being offered to him. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "I do not wish for you to harbor resentment later, believing you sacrificed something important for my sake." The Duke reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his expression filled with a tenderness that spoke volumes about how far their relationship had evolved since their earliest, more guarded interactions. "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in years," he said quietly. "You are not an obstacle to my happiness, Elena. You are the very reason I have finally found genuine contentment within a life that once felt hollow and purposeless." As they stood together in the quiet study, the winter snow continuing its steady descent outside the windows, Elena felt the last remnants of her earlier anxiety finally dissolve, replaced by a renewed confidence in the strength of their bond. Yet even as this particular challenge resolved itself through mutual understanding and commitment, neither Elena nor the Duke could have anticipated the final test still waiting on the horizon, one that would require them to demonstrate the full depth of their devotion to one another, in ways neither had yet imagined. Spring arrived at Dellamoor with a gentle warmth that gradually melted away the last remnants of winter frost. The gardens Edmund had so carefully protected now beginning to bloom with renewed vibrancy. Elena found herself walking through these gardens more frequently as the weather improved, appreciating the quiet beauty that had become such an integral part of her daily life within these walls. The Duke's decision to decline the royal court's advisory position had been met with mixed reactions among their social circle. Though the genuine respect he had earned through his public commitment to Elena during the earlier gathering seemed to outweigh any lingering criticism from those who valued political advancement above personal integrity. Life at Dellamoor settled into a peaceful rhythm, one that allowed Elena and the Duke to continue building the genuine partnership they had discovered together. However, this peace was disrupted one afternoon when an urgent message arrived from a neighboring estate, informing the household that a severe illness had begun spreading through several villages within Dellamoor's territory. The Duke immediately called for a meeting with his estate managers, determined to address the situation before it could escalate into a broader crisis affecting the well-being of countless families who depended on his stewardship. Elena insisted on joining these discussions, drawing on her own experience managing the household's daily challenges to offer practical suggestions regarding resource allocation and the coordination of medical assistance for the affected villages. The Duke, recognizing the value of her perspective, welcomed her involvement without hesitation, a stark contrast to how her own family had once dismissed her opinions as inconsequential. Together, they organized a comprehensive response, dispatching physicians from Dellamoor's own resources to the affected areas, arranging for supplies of food and medicine to reach families who could not afford such necessities on their own, and establishing careful protocols to prevent the illness from spreading further throughout the region. Elena found herself directly involved in coordinating these efforts, traveling alongside the Duke to the affected villages to assess conditions firsthand and ensure their response efforts were meeting the actual needs of the suffering families. During one such visit to a particularly hard-hit village, Elena encountered a young mother struggling to care for her 3 children while battling the illness herself, her husband having succumbed to the disease just days earlier. The woman's exhaustion and grief struck Elena deeply, reminding her of her own mother's occasional moments of genuine struggle, buried beneath layers of calculated ambition that had defined so much of Elena's childhood. Without hesitation, Elena knelt beside the woman, offering comfort and practical assistance, helping to arrange for proper medical care, and ensuring her children would be looked after while she recovered. The Duke observed this interaction from a short distance, his expression carrying a depth of admiration and love that Elena had come to recognize as uniquely his own. "You have a remarkable gift," he said later, as they traveled back toward Dellamoor in the fading afternoon light, "for offering comfort to those who need it most, without any expectation of recognition or gratitude in return." Elena smiled softly, grateful for his words. "I simply remember what it felt like to need help and receive none," she said. "I never wish for anyone else to experience that same isolation, if I can help prevent it." As the crisis gradually eased over the following weeks, thanks to their coordinated efforts and the resilience of the affected communities, Elena found herself increasingly respected, not only by the household staff at Dellamoor, but by the broader population within the Duke's territory. Villagers began referring to her with genuine affection, recognizing the authentic care she brought to her role as Duchess, a stark contrast to the distant, purely ceremonial relationship many previous nobility had maintained with those under their care. This growing respect did not go unnoticed by the Duke, who found himself increasingly proud of the woman he had married, recognizing that her presence had not only transformed his own life, but had begun positively influencing the entire community connected to Dellamoor's estate. During a quiet evening together, as they reviewed reports confirming the crisis had finally been fully resolved, the Duke turned to Elena with an expression of profound gratitude. "You have given this estate something it desperately needed," he said softly. "Not just careful management or practical solutions, but genuine compassion that reaches every person connected to Dellamoor, regardless of their station or circumstance." Elena felt her heart swell with happiness at his words, recognizing how far they had both traveled since that first uncertain meeting in the grand hall of her family's estate. "I could not have accomplished any of this without your support," she said honestly. "You gave me the opportunity to discover strengths I never knew I possessed." As spring gradually transitioned into early summer, Elena and the Duke's relationship continued to deepen, their partnership extending beyond simple romantic affection into a genuine collaboration that benefited everyone within their care. Elena took on increasing responsibilities within the estate's management, her insights and practical wisdom proving invaluable as they navigated various challenges together. One evening, as they sat together in the gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the Duke turned to Elena with an expression of quiet contentment. "Do you remember," he asked, "our conversation about why I chose you, all those months ago?" Elena nodded, recalling that pivotal conversation in the frost-covered field, where the truth behind their marriage had finally been revealed. "I told you then that I had observed your kindness from a distance, years before we officially met," he continued, "but I did not fully understand, at the time, just how much that single observation would come to define the rest of my life. You have become more than simply my wife, Elena. You have become the very foundation upon which I have rebuilt everything I once believed impossible to reclaim. Genuine happiness, authentic connection, purpose beyond mere duty." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes at the depth of his words, moved by how far their relationship had evolved from its uncertain beginnings. "And you have given me something I spent my entire life believing I would never possess," she replied softly. "A place where I truly belong, where my presence matters beyond simple obligation or expectation." As they continued watching the sunset together, hands intertwined, Elena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The overlooked daughter who had once stood quietly at the edges of every gathering, dismissed and forgotten by her own family, had somehow found herself not only accepted, but genuinely cherished, by a man the entire region had once considered incapable of warmth or affection. Yet even as this profound sense of contentment settled over her, Elena understood that their story was far from finished. The challenges they had faced together, from her family's manipulative visit to Cordelia's bitter attempts at sabotage, had only strengthened the bond between them, preparing them for whatever future obstacles might still arise as they continued building their life together within the walls of Dellamoor. She did not know, as she sat there watching the final rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon, that the greatest test of their commitment to one another still awaited them. One final challenge that would require every ounce of strength and devotion they had cultivated throughout their journey together. A challenge that would ultimately cement their bond as one built not on convenience or calculation, but on genuine, unshakable love. The final challenge arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a letter delivered directly to the Duke from a distant relative, claiming a legal right to contest his inheritance of the Dellamoor title, citing an obscure clause within their family's ancestral documents that suggested the succession might not have been properly executed decades earlier. The claim threatened not only the Duke's position, but the entire stability of the estate, along with the security of everyone who depended on Dellamoor for their livelihood. Elena watched as the Duke's usual composure faltered slightly upon reading the letter, the weight of this unexpected threat settling heavily across his shoulders. "This cannot be legitimate," he said, though uncertainty colored his usually confident tone. "My father secured this inheritance through proper legal channels. I do not understand how such a claim could arise now, after all these years." Elena moved to his side immediately, offering quiet support as he processed this troubling development. "What can we do?" she asked, determined to help navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. "We will need to consult with legal advisors," the Duke explained, gathering his thoughts with visible effort, "and gather whatever documentation exists to prove the legitimacy of my father's inheritance. This process could take considerable time, and there is no guarantee of the outcome." Over the following weeks, Elena and the Duke worked tirelessly alongside legal advisors, poring over decades-old documents stored within Dellamoor's extensive archives, searching for evidence that would definitively establish the legitimacy of the Duke's claim to his ancestral title. Elena's careful attention to detail, honed through months of managing the estate's daily operations, proved invaluable during this exhaustive process, often noticing small discrepancies or connections that the legal advisors themselves had overlooked. During one particularly long evening spent reviewing documents in the estate's archive, Elena discovered a crucial piece of evidence, a properly witnessed and sealed document that clearly established the legal transfer of the title decades earlier, directly contradicting the claims made by the distant relative seeking to challenge the Duke's inheritance. "I believe I have found something significant," she announced, carefully examining the aged document to ensure she had not misunderstood its contents. The Duke rushed to her side, his expression shifting from exhaustion to cautious hope as he reviewed the document she had discovered. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, relief evident in his voice. "This should definitively settle the matter in our favor." With this crucial evidence in hand, their legal advisors moved quickly to formally address the challenge, presenting the documentation to the appropriate authorities within the royal court. The process, though still requiring several additional weeks to fully resolve, ultimately concluded in the Duke's favor. The distant relative's claim dismissed entirely, once the legitimacy of the original inheritance had been thoroughly established. The relief that settled over Dellamoor following this resolution was palpable, the entire household finally able to release the tension that had gripped them throughout the challenging weeks of uncertainty. Elena and the Duke celebrated privately that evening, grateful that their combined efforts had successfully protected not only their own future, but the security of everyone who depended on Dellamoor's continued stability. "You saved us," the Duke said softly, as they sat together in the study, the crisis finally behind them. "Your attention to detail, your dedication to finding a solution, it made all the difference in resolving this matter successfully." Elena smiled, grateful that her skills, once dismissed as inconsequential by her own family, had proven so valuable in protecting the life and legacy she and the Duke had built together. "We saved us," she corrected gently, This was never something either of us could have accomplished alone. As the challenging weeks following the inheritance dispute finally gave way to a renewed sense of peace and stability, Elena found herself reflecting on the incredible transformation her life had undergone since that fateful evening in her family's grand hall, when the Duke had first uttered those words that had once stung so deeply. "I'll take the rejected one." What had begun as words of calculated dismissal had ultimately led her to a life filled with genuine love, purpose, and belonging that she had never dared to imagine possible. She had gone from being overlooked and undervalued within her own family to becoming a respected and cherished duchess, her contributions recognized not only by her husband, but by the entire community connected to Dellamoor's estate. Several months later, as autumn once again began settling over the region, Elena received an invitation to a gathering hosted by her own family, an event celebrating Margaret's recent engagement to a minor nobleman from a neighboring province. Unlike previous interactions with her family, Elena approached this invitation with a newfound confidence and security, no longer burdened by the desperate need for their approval that had once defined so much of her early life. When she and the Duke arrived at the gathering, Elena noticed her mother's expression shift subtly upon seeing her, a mixture of pride and lingering resentment evident beneath Lady Beatrice's carefully composed smile. "Elena, my dear, you look radiant," her mother said, embracing her with practiced warmth. "Marriage has clearly agreed with you far more than we anticipated." Elena accepted the compliment graciously, though she recognized the underlying implication within her mother's words, the acknowledgement that Elena's success had exceeded whatever expectations her family had once held for their overlooked daughter. "Thank you, Mother," she replied evenly. "I have found genuine happiness within my marriage, something I am deeply grateful for every day." Throughout the evening, Elena noticed how differently her family now treated her, their previous dismissiveness replaced by a cautious respect that stemmed directly from her elevated status as Duchess. Yet Elena found herself unaffected by this shift in behavior, secure enough in her own identity and worth that she no longer required external validation to feel confident in who she had become. As the gathering concluded and Elena prepared to depart with the Duke, her father approached her privately, his expression carrying an unusual vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him throughout her childhood. "Elena," he said quietly, "I believe we did not always treat you as you deserved. I am glad to see you have found happiness despite our failures." Elena studied her father's expression, recognizing the genuine sentiment behind his words, even if it arrived considerably later than she might have once hoped for. "Thank you for saying that," she replied honestly. "I have chosen to focus on the life I am building now, rather than dwelling on what was lacking before." As she and the Duke traveled back toward Dellamoor that evening, Elena felt a profound sense of closure regarding her complicated relationship with her family, finally at peace with both her past and the extraordinary life she had built since that fateful night when the Duke had first chosen her among all the women in that grand hall. The following spring, Elena and the Duke welcomed their first child, a daughter they named after Elena's own grandmother, a woman who had shown Elena small kindnesses during her childhood despite the general dismissiveness of the rest of the family. As Elena held her newborn daughter for the first time, the Duke beside her with tears of joy in his eyes, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed since those difficult early years of feeling overlooked and unwanted. Their daughter would never know what it felt like to be dismissed or undervalued, Elena vowed silently, watching as the Duke gently cradled their child with a tenderness that spoke to just how far he had traveled from the cold, guarded man she had first married. She would grow up surrounded by genuine love and acceptance, never questioning her worth or her place within her family. Years later, as Elena and the Duke continued building their life together at Dellamoor, their household growing to include several more children who filled the once quiet halls with laughter and warmth, Elena often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this life. The words that had once stung so deeply, "I'll take the rejected one," had ultimately led her to discover not rejection, but the deepest acceptance and love she had ever known. The story of Elena and the Duke of Dellamoor became something of a legend throughout the region, a tale passed down through generations, reminding everyone who heard it that true worth is rarely determined by first impressions or the calculated judgments of those who fail to look beyond the surface. Elena, once dismissed as unremarkable by her own family, had become not only a beloved duchess, but a symbol of quiet strength and genuine kindness. proving that sometimes, being overlooked by those who cannot recognize true value simply means being reserved for someone who finally can. And so, within the ancient walls of Dellamoor, surrounded by the family and community she had built through genuine love rather than mere obligation, Elena finally found the place she had always belonged, no longer the rejected one, but the cherished heart of a home, built on authentic devotion, resilience, and the quiet strength that had defined her from the very beginning.